Spring games all over the place yesterday. I think most of you probably noticed at least something yesterday. Well, we noticed like 47 things. So let's dive right in. Oklahoma had a spring game yesterday. Boy, did they. In fact, raise your hand if you were in that state and you weren't at the spring game. Look at these pictures. If you're listening on podcast, just imagine a sea of humanity, basically a sea of humanity. And then I got a lot of folks coming back on the other side telling me no one cares about spring game attendance and there's just more to do in other places of the country. Those folks, by the way, the ones who live in the alleged more things to do portions of the country, do about the same 3 or 4 things per week. So their social lives are not indicative of what they suggest they should be. This matters. Crowds at spring games matter, especially if you have a new head coach in town, you got a new staff in town. It's a huge recruiting event. I want you to think for just a second. If you're telling me that doesn't matter, it's probably a defense mechanism because your school didn't show out like Oklahoma's. But if you really do believe it doesn't matter, let me ask you a question. What control over a football program do you have as a fan? The answer is really pretty limited. I mean, once you've given your money, of course. If you don't give money, if you don't show up, then the program just collapses. But once you've done that, how do you affect a football program? And the answer is the spring game, attendance, is one of the few very, very isolated instances of an event that you can control, that you can impact in a positive way. It's a huge recruiting event for everyone, but that is worth millions upon millions of dollars in marketing, and it screams to recruits, and it screams to the university and the rest of college football. Well, we're serious, first off. Secondly, we're fully invested and bought in. And thirdly, a lot of that, that you've been talking about us is kind of in our rearview mirror. You're a lot more focused on it than we are at this point. So yes, I was impressed with that. That matters to me. But as for on the field goings on, it's an early glimpse I thought we saw yesterday into the style that we should expect from Brent Venables and his team in 2022 specifically, but really just beyond. I don't really think we used complementary football to describe Lincoln Riley's Oklahoma. That doesn't mean they weren't effective. It's just we never talked about complementary football a whole lot. We never went into a big Oklahoma game talking about multiple levels of defense being improved and we think that they're going to carry this afternoon for OU. It was going to be, can Lincoln Riley's offense outscore the opposition? More times than not, they could. It's never a bad thing to be scoring points. That's the name of the game. But, well, the real name of the game is winning football games, actually. That's what the real name of the game is. So we saw yesterday, and we've heard all spring out of Norman, about the more complementary approach. And they've really honed in, especially Brent Venables being the defensive guy that he is honed in on his safety position. And they gave you reason to believe, based on the small sample size you got yesterday, there's improvement happening there. It's not done, and they got a lot of bodies that they can rotate in there. But defense is going to be improved for Oklahoma. It's a matter of how much it's improved for them this year. But also, special teams is a premium area of emphasis that they've invested in. That's not rare. It's not like Oklahoma's the only one doing that. But what you'll see come fall, whether it's this run game, whether it's Dylan Gabriel's ability to maybe improvise on the run after plays break down, I think you'll see a whole lot more complementary style of football that will probably yield Oklahoma to being less vulnerable to wild volatility in outcomes. You know, the kind where you score 56 on someone one week and then all of a sudden you got 17 on the board late third quarter the next week and you're asking, how did that happen? Probably won't see that as much. Doesn't mean they're going to go undefeated, but you probably won't see that as much. Javante Barnes is a 4-star true freshman running back. They gave him the ball a lot yesterday. He, along with Eric Gray, I think it's going to be a really good 1-2 tailback tandem there, but just a complementary style. Probably a lot more than you saw with the previous staff. That doesn't guarantee success. Just telling you, you got a good glimpse that that's the way they plan on going about things. What about LSU? LSU, I don't think it popped a whole lot on the national scene yesterday. I think Oklahoma dominated a lot of the headlines, but I think spring and the spring game, it kind of gave you something that I think is true to reality down there. So what I'm saying is your eyes didn't deceive you. There weren't some guys who shined yesterday who really have not been much to write home about the rest of spring and vice versa. Running back area, Brian Kelly's talked about it. It looks improved. John Emery is a guy specifically in the SEC that a lot of people have looked at the tailback position and have longed for him to take the next step, and especially in and around Baton Rouge. They have good quarterback depth. I think that probably if you watched this game yesterday, you got a little more reason to understand why I have been very hesitant to buy into the Jaden Daniels is the preemptive favorite at quarterback talking point that a lot of people have parroted around the country at LSU. Because he's not. He could very well end up being their starting quarterback. If I had to name a guy right now, or let me back up, I'm not naming anyone. If I had to pick a guy that's going to end up being the starting quarterback for LSU, it's going to be a guy who's already done it before. It would be Miles Brennan. And to be real with you, Garrett Nussmeier would probably be the next guy. There's no doubting Jaden Daniels' athleticism. I think anyone who watched that, or forget that, anyone who's watched him at Arizona State before he got there yesterday knew that. But Brian Kelly, knowing what we know about him, which is like 18 or 19 years worth at this point, is not going to deal with lack of accuracy at the quarterback position. And Jaden Daniels has not displayed precision passing ability, shall we say. I think Miles Brennan has more of what Brian Kelly's looking for. I think Garrett Nussmeier may end up having more than all of them when all's said and done. So if you wanted to place odds here, certainly you can give me any kind of plus money with Miles Brennan or Garrett Nussmeier right now. You want to make Jaden Daniels the favorite, you go ahead. I don't feel that way at the moment. But also the depth, LSU fans will tell you this before anyone else will, it leaves a lot to be desired at a number of positions across the roster. They've got some good frontline guys, and they've got some good depth now. Defensive line, linebacker looks pretty good, but there are places, obviously, when you inherit the kind of scholarship situation they did, it's not going to fix itself overnight. That's why they've got to emphasize recruiting like 8 days out of the week. They got to invest heavily in the transfer portal. But I will tell you this, Brian Kelly's not going to cut corners in 2022. And even if that means sacrificing some short-term ability to give himself a better chance to win a football game, they're not going to cut corners. They're going to invest in the long term down there. It seems like such a better structured organization from everybody you talk to. I'm not talking about watching a spring game now. I mean getting feedback from people who walk the halls every day, in some cases who are on the field on Saturdays, and that's to be expected. I mean, when you go from Ed Orgeron to Brian Kelly, that's to be expected. So LSU, I think they've got a lot to be excited about there. I think largely LSU's spring game delivered exactly what I expected it to. Texas had kind of a spring scrimmage / spring game last night. I thought it validated a whole lot of what we've heard out of camp. I saw someone mention this earlier today, and I'll echo it. I think the Texas beat, our folks over at Horns 24/7, Chip Brown and company, I think they've done a fantastic job of accurately disseminating what the reality is there. Because everything they've reported was on display. Everything. And so you can go up and down the list. I've got a couple that I wanted to talk about here. Offensive line. Like, it's no shock to anyone who's followed Texas that looked like a MASH unit that is badly in need of the half a dozen future enrollees that are going to be on campus in June. So they needed help there. They're going to get help there. But as for yesterday's spring game, the reason they couldn't have one is because they didn't have enough two offensive lines, at least without risking serious, like, career-ending injury to quarterbacks and whatnot. So you've got that. I think that's a unit, I mean, in 12 months from now, we will talk about and we'll say, do you remember that hodgepodge of a mess they put on the field in the spring game of 2022? Because that's how much better they stand to be this time of year from now than they are right now. They made the best out of a less than ideal situation yesterday, but it looks like they hit on Isaiah Nair. That's that wide receiver transfer we talked about out of Wyoming, who didn't garner a lot of national headline because he was coming out of Wyoming. You have this perception about a wide receiver from Wyoming. Really good. And I get to pair him with Whittington. I get to pair him with Xavier Worthy. But everyone was focused on the quarterback situation yesterday. Quinn Ewers and Hudson Card. I think I got a text from a buddy yesterday that indicates what many of you felt. If you just take that spring game in a vacuum and you just look at productivity, you would be led to believe this is a pretty legitimate quarterback battle. Like, there's not a whole lot separating these two. I think there is going to be a significant separation between the two by the time fall rolls around. And I think that guy listed on top right now, if you're watching on YouTube, Quinn Ewers, I think that's going to be the guy who definitively takes this job. He does not definitively have it right now, but when you look at where he is relative to Hudson Card, and then you understand where they are in their respective developments, and then you understand Quinn Ewers, who is all world physically, has an entire summer session and then fall camp still in front of him, you will see the cream rise. That's not a knock on Hudson Card. There's a reason Quinn Ewers has had the hype behind his name. It's not all just industry hype. Certainly he's not accomplished anything yet, but he is the real deal. Everyone wanted him for a reason. Sark badly wanted him for a reason, and the reason will eventually manifest itself, I think, in him starting for them. But Sark had a press conference after the spring game, and he said something that kind of caught my ear that I think a lot of folks would just label coach speak. He was asked, hey, what's different? Does anything feel different now versus a year ago? He said, to be honest with you, I feel like we're a team right now. And then he kind of stopped himself. But what he really wanted to say is, I didn't feel like we were a team last year. Now, obviously, in retrospect, you wish the coaches would have told you that in real time so you didn't waste a whole lot of your money betting on said team, but they can't do that. I think some folks are going to listen to that and say, everybody's going to say that. No, everybody's not going to say that. That guy did, though. Steve Sarkisian did, which kind of goes back to one of the themes I was talking about. I wanted to see that quarterback battle. I wanted to, see some of the defensive odds and ends, but I also wanted to feel Texas. Feel the same way with USC. Going to talk about them in a second. I wanted to, as I said, I wanted to metaphorically stick the thermometer in Texas and just kind of pull it out and see what we have there. And I think what we have is intangible in nature. As I said, there's no metric. You don't really quantify this. But a Texas fan, like if you're watching from Laredo, Texas, for example, and you knew last year's team and you're watching an early version of this year's team, you know if it feels different. And I watched Texas yesterday. It did feel a little bit different to me. It's always a work in progress in the spring. The eventual national champion, whomstever that is a work in progress right now. From Tuscaloosa to Athens to Austin and everywhere in between. It's not that. It's does it feel different? And I think Steve Sarkisian is being really brutally honest with you when he says, I didn't feel like we had a team last year. I think we do this year. Now, Steve Sarkisian has his own checkered past as a head coach. This is not Nick Saban. This is not a guy where you roll out his resume and it's got multiple national championships from different programs on it to where his approach is above reproach. His approach you don't question. In other words, if it doesn't work out in any given year, must have been the player's fault, not his fault. This is not Nick Saban. This is Steve Sarkisian, a guy still very much trying to find his way. So you could have had a moment of genuine kind of introspective reflection there where he's telling you, look, I'm still feeling my way out too. I'm a head coach that's still kind of trying to figure out what that perfect formula is too. We didn't have it last year, and I feel like maybe we've got it a lot more this year. I don't think that's nothing. I mean, ultimately, you have to execute on the field in the fall, but it helps a whole heck of a lot more if you got a lot of synergy and cohesion inside that locker room and the right guys inside the locker room. I think that's why I've called Texas the most interesting program in the country this year. That's a huge, huge storyline. Also, here's another question for you to just ponder. If we could give that team an above-average offensive line, they may not have that this year, but if we gave them just an above-average O-line, how much different would this year be? Think on that. We got a few months. Penn State, do not overlook what James Franklin said after their spring game wrapped up. He said, well, it helps that we have a second-year offensive coordinator here. Now, that sounds like common sense. It is, but you have to understand the context. They haven't had that here. And these players, Sean Clifford, chief among them, the quarterback there, hasn't really had that. Certainly this wide receiver core, which I think is very underrated. I think the tight end core is very underrated for that matter. They haven't had that. Mike Yursich, who's also known as Tom Yursich on this show, because he's one of like three guys I just never remember the first name of. He could be sitting right there. I'd say, hey, Mom, which is a mixture of Mike and Tom. I think it's a really big deal, actually, that he's back now for a second year. And it really manifested itself, I think, this spring in the way they divvied up these quarterback reps. Now, for his credit, James Franklin did something yesterday that not a lot of coaches do. They closed the practices to the public for a reason, except the spring game. But then he trotted right out there in front of the assembled media yesterday, pulled out a chart, and told you exactly how many reps every quarterback took in the spring. And when he said reps, he meant actual throws, so not just snaps. I think it dispelled one of the brief myths that had existed around Penn State football this spring, which was Drew Aller, the five-star true freshman, is going to come in and immediately compete with Sean Clifford. You heard the tone in my voice when people mentioned that, and I was very hesitant. Producer Jesse mentioned that, and I was very hesitant. That's not happening. Immediately, at least, it's not happening. Clifford had like 2-to-1 reps to whoever was number two. And another thing that James Franklin did yesterday that I would advise every head coach to do was when he got asked, hey, who stood out in spring? Which is the most boilerplate softball of a question that the assembled media could ever toss a head coach at the end of spring. They're expecting 2 names, 45-second to a minute-and-a-half response. Let's move on. James Franklin talked for, I want to say, about 5 minutes straight. I think there are maybe 2 or 3 names on his roster he didn't list. He pretty much named everyone else. That is the only way to go about it in the transfer portal era. You got to talk everyone up. You got to make everyone think that they either had the best spring of their career or they're just that close, just 1 or 2 little tweaks in the summer conditioning program, and you're going to be right there. Very, very smart move on the part of James Franklin. He said this is the deepest overall they felt. Now, he said we may not be quite as talented frontline to frontline as we've been, but I think we're the deepest we've been. I think this incoming true freshman class, he said, is the overall most ready to contribute that it's been. So you can take that 1 of 2 ways. You can either think, oh, good, they're going to be a little above average, but he told me they don't have any superstars. I've watched Penn State football for several years under Franklin. I don't really think it's superstars that have won games for them. I think it's been pretty solid play. In other words, I've watched Penn State games, and a whole lot more times than not, the game is lost by one side or the other rather than the game just being taken. So I look at Penn State, and I feel really good when he tells me, we got a lot of depth, you know? In other words, we can afford to lose a guy or 2. Don't want to, but probably will. It is football. And we're not going to fall off a cliff production-wise. Look at this schedule. If you're watching on YouTube, there are a lot of one-possession games, inevitably, on this schedule. If you tell me you trust your depth a little bit more, and you still got some really good playmakers, don't short sell them, and you got some true freshmen ready to contribute, and you got experience at the quarterback position and a second-year OC, you don't know the Bob stuff, the bounce of ball stuff. You don't know when Minnesota comes to town. 23-17, who's the 23, who's the 17? That stuff he's talking about here in April could very well be what decides that in October. So a lot of kind of consistency that you think you can depend on, and consistency is really a core tenet of many of the contenders that are still around in November. What about USC? Everyone was excited to talk about this USC spring game. Now, I know that there was some chirping back and forth between USC folks and Oklahoma folks. Oklahoma had an incredible spring game and an incredible spring attendance figure. USC did not match that. Now, is that how we should look at it? I would argue no. Now, they despise me on the USC board, so you would think I have every reason to rail against them. But they hate me for false reasons, so really I'm not going to feed into that. Here's what you do need to know about USC. They actually had a great crowd yesterday. I know you saw the freeze frames on Twitter. Oftentimes those are taken before the game starts, by the way. I don't know if you've realized this or not, but there are some people out there who are agenda-driven in nature who kind of want to feed into a certain overwhelming mentality that already exists. Yes, it happens, believe it or not, even in our space. USC had a good crowd by USC standards. They're not going to pack the Coliseum on a Saturday in April. But what if I told you, alternate headline, that USC had the most attended spring game for them since the 90s? As we're showing footage here, you may not believe that, but all I have to go on is what's happened at USC in the past. So good on Lincoln Riley. Believe it or not, these words are about to come out of my mouth for drawing a big crowd at the Coliseum yesterday, all things considered. We talked about kind of the same thing with Texas. How's it going to feel and how are they going to tackle? All the rest of the stuff's going to work itself out. I did not expect a well-oiled machine of an offense. I mean, they're still trying to catch their breath from putting a staff together, much less putting an offense and installing everything together. And you're not going to see it in spring games even if they have. But they tackled pretty good yesterday, which was sorely missing last year, spring and otherwise. Also, the feel is there. It goes back to that whole intangible thing, but Lincoln Riley's been pretty emphatic about this. And a lot of those players have been pretty emphatic. They've talked about how far they feel like they've come in just a couple of months since the new staff's been on campus. Lincoln Riley really, really emphatically talking like that. So you can take your pick. You can either listen to that and say, well, what else is he going to tell me? Or you can listen to it and say, well, if he didn't truly feel that way, maybe he just wouldn't say anything about it. I will say this, it's always the best approach to go to the people who cover the program and go to the fans. because you see them every now and then. Those folks see them all the time. And the overwhelming consensus around USC is, I have no doubt this is the right staff at the right time. I have no doubt in the direction. I don't think they're done in the transfer portal, so you don't see the full USC that you'll see in the fall quite yet. But the feel overall, which pertains to 2022 and beyond, feels exactly how they want it to feel. They're going to have a wild kind of scale of volatility about their potential results this fall too. You know, I'm looking at the schedule right now. They go to Utah on the 15th of October. I don't think USC is the favorite in the South right now. I don't think a lot of their fans think they are. I do think that they feel once this offense gets to whatever product it's going to be, they will have more than a puncher's chance. But it's about a whole lot more than 2022, which, I mean, USC fans understand that. I hope the rest of the country does. There'll be some ups and downs for them this year. This is a product that they have to overturn, which doesn't happen overnight. But I felt kind of different than the rest of the country did. I think the rest of the country kind of took an opportunity yesterday to say, ha ha, look at what you don't have there. Okay. I mean, I can only go on what they had there last year and then compare it to what they have now. And what they have now, a whole lot better than what they had last year. And that staff's only been there 3 months. Let's give it a little time, shall we? What about Oregon? This was a big spring crowd. Look at this. It's a pretty picture if you're listening on podcast. Imagine clear blue Oregon skies and people. Again, as far as the eye can see, they had a little over 43,000 in attendance for Dan Lanning's first spring game. Man, it just looks good. I kind of like looking at that for a little while. Immunity. I would be surprised at this point if Bo Nix is not the starting quarterback for this team. And I didn't say that when he transferred there. When he transferred there, I was holding out hope that Ty Thompson, who was a true freshman last year, was going to make a kind of a quantum leap this spring. And it's not like it's out of the realm of possibility that he still could. I didn't see it yesterday. To be honest with you, I thought Butterfield, who is the guy he's battling with for second, I thought they looked very comparable, and I thought Bo Nix was the clear number one. I don't think that's going to change. So I'd be surprised at this point, of course, barring injury, if Bo Nix is not the starting quarterback for Oregon. They had a big emphasis yesterday on pushing the ball down the field, which was one of the primary gripes that a lot of Duck fans have had, especially last year. Remember last year, we were going into the season, and I was really high on that wide receiver core. Still am, for that matter. And Oregon fans kind of felt the same way. They looked around, they read the practice reports, they watched the spring games, they watched the games and said, boy, don't we seem talented? Don't we seem a little more talented out wide than we're featuring from our play calling perspective? Well, this staff walked in and apparently thinks yes, at least if yesterday's any indication, and spring intel has been any indication. So they plan on using that wide receiver core, pushing the ball down the field. All these quarterbacks, every one of them I just mentioned, had at least one explosive play downfield yesterday. Yeah, it's a spring game, but I mean, some staffs dial it back in the spring. So at least they dialed it the other way. I'm excited to watch that, though. One of the things I'll watch on the West Coast this fall is how Oregon and that first-year staff up there, how they utilize that wide receiver core, because they inherited some good guys there, and they've got an interesting quarterback battle, one of the more intriguing quarterback battles, and not just who's going to be the starter. I just told you, I think Nix has got that job on semi-lock for the time being, but, you know, if Ty Thompson doesn't make that move and really secures that number 2 spot and battles Bo Nix, you know, I just kind of leave it open-ended, but I just kind of wonder there. I just kind of wonder. Had high hopes, still do, but just kind of wonder. So that's a look around the country yesterday at many things that I took away from spring game